Hello. Today we're going to be looking at the Nixon years, and this is the point in U.S. history where I depart from our textbook, not following the typical chapter structure, and really begin to look at primarily the individual decades and oftentimes the presidents associated with those decades. So we're really kind of starting into the 1970s. Now we've had some overlap. Some of the past chapters have already covered parts of the early 1970s. But today we're specifically looking at the Nixon years. Nixon actually was elected in 1968, became president in January of 1969, but his presidency, he actually was elected to 2 terms and carried into the mid-1970s. He was re-elected in 1972. And it was in that second term, early in the second term, where really the Watergate scandal broke. And that's one of the major themes that we're going to be talking about as we look at the Nixon years. And you may wonder, well, how big was the Watergate scandal? Well, the Watergate scandal was so big that now it's common whenever there's a scandal to just attach "gate" to the end of it to help define a scandal. Like Lewinsky Gate, File Gate. I'm surprised people haven't attached "gate" to Benghazi. Anytime there's a scandal, people want to attach a "gate" to the end of it, and that somehow identifies it as a scandal. But that all goes back to the Watergate scandal. We'll be looking at that. So the time period that we're going to be looking at first we look at the Nixon years, then we're going to move on. We'll look at the Ford and Carter administrations. Ford served part of a term, really. He finished out Nixon's second term, ran for election, lost, and then Jimmy Carter was elected to 1 term as president, and that carries us into the 1980s. That's what's coming. Our learning objectives here are to explain Nixon's plan for winning Southern support, to describe détente under Nixon, and to explain Nixon's approach to economics. So, first, we start with the 1968 election. And to go back at this point in time, if you think back a few chapters, we previously looked at the Vietnam War. And so, Nixon was elected during the Vietnam War. Nixon ran on the Republican ticket, and to give a little bit of background, prior to the 1968 election, 1968 was a year that starts with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and it takes the U.S. 3 months to get the upper hand. Johnson feels that he is losing support. Johnson announces that he will not seek nor accept his party's nomination for another term as president. So with that, Johnson steps aside. So with Johnson out of the race, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, was running. Also, Robert Kennedy, or Bobby Kennedy, John F. K's younger brother, was running. And then, of course, more tragedies took place. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April. Then in June, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated after winning the California primary. And so then by the time August rolls around, you have riots out in front of the Democratic National Convention, and there's a tremendous amount of chaos. Nixon has promised to end the Vietnam War in a strategy of providing peace with honor. And so Nixon wins the 1968 election, and he wins it by taking 43.4% of the popular vote, which of course is not a majority. He defeated Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, and George Wallace, who was running for the American Independent Party. He promised to restore law and order and bring back conservative values. Now, keep in mind that at this point in time, as we head into the late 1960s, we've seen this counterculture movement that's taking off. There's many new attitudes. People are questioning things. Young people seem to be defiant. Which shocks many Americans. there's a very different sense in this country as people are not quite certain the direction the country's headed. Some people felt literally the country was falling apart at the seams. And so here comes Nixon. He's promising a return to conservative values. He's going to restore peace and order. This appeals to many Americans. And so, once again, he's going to get us out of Vietnam. He's promised peace with honor. And he also promised a streamlined government, and this appealed to many Americans. So here you can take a look at the electoral map, and as you can see, the blue states went to the Democratic candidate, Humphrey. The red states went to Nixon, and the orange states went to George Wallace, the American independent. You can see Wallace's power was really concentrated in the Deep South. So one key to Nixon's victory was the support of Southern whites. Nixon promised to appoint conservative justices. He opposed mandated busing, which once again, if you think back to the civil rights era, things that we had talked about there was that you had the desegregation of the schools really kind of brought about by the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. And so with that, the idea is that now schools are supposed to become desegregated. But while you now had ended the legalized segregation, what we would call de jure segregation, there was still de facto segregation, which was segregation based on custom and practice. And they had to bring an end to the de facto segregation. And so one method of doing that was mandated busing. Because typically even though you may not have a legalized segregation, the fact of the matter is you still had predominantly black neighborhoods that would attend predominantly black schools, and predominantly white neighborhoods that attended predominantly white schools. So if you're going to integrate the schools, busing was a way to do that. You could bus people out of their home district and into another district to achieve integration. And many whites were opposed to this mandated busing. And so Nixon wins their support by promising to help slow desegregation in the South. He opposes mandated busing. And he promised he's going to appoint a Southerner to the Supreme Court. He says he'll appoint more Southern justices. So many Southern whites who previously had supported the Democratic Party shift their party loyalty to the Republican Party in this time frame. And this kind of completes a swap, because in the 1940s we began to see many African Americans switch their party loyalty from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. Now we've got those former Southern white Democrats, those states that had been strong Democratic states. Remember that the Republican Party was initially the abolition party. And that was their primary issue. And so the Southern whites had traditionally been very strong Democratic Party voters, and they'd been very opposed to the Republican Party, because once again the Republican Party really kind of stood on the other side of the issue. But things have kind of come full circle. Now we begin to see many white Southern voters begin to shift their party allegiance to the Republican Party. And this really becomes the basis of the Southern strategy, which really becomes a plan that Nixon puts into place to win Southern support. He took steps to slow desegregation in the South, which gained him support from the South. And this, like I said, becomes known as a Southern strategy to help Nixon shore up that white Southern votes. He appeals to them. And Nixon also appealed to what we might call Middle America. He was critical of Supreme Court decisions that expanded the rights of accused criminals, a lot of what had taken place under the Warren Court. And he kept his promise and appointed conservative judges to the Supreme Court, including one from the South. Now, as far as foreign policy, Nixon's foreign policy was a major focus of his first term, and he chose Henry Kissinger, a former Harvard professor, as his security advisor. And Kissinger plays a major role. Kissinger is involved in helping to negotiate the peace settlement that gets us out of Vietnam. Nixon was anti-communist, but he also believed that to achieve world peace, we must improve relations with communist nations, including China and the Soviet Union. Nixon's policy was known as détente, or a relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union. And so, first, he travels to China. Now, something else that had gone on is that, to give a little bit of background here, tension had developed between the Soviet Union and China. Although both are communist countries and both shared a border, the two countries kind of found themselves kind of at odds with one another. For example, communism as it was applied in the Soviet Union was really focused primarily on workers, really based on Marxist ideology. But with Mao Zedong in China, the communists had come to have a different focus. They had never really focused on communism as being worker-based, but more based on the peasants. And so this different application, a different philosophy on communism kind of creates a little bit of a rift between the Soviet Union and China. And tensions begin to grow between the two. And so what Nixon does very wisely is he reaches out to China. And Nixon lifts trade and travel restrictions with China. And he removed the 7th Fleet from Taiwan. And the 7th Fleet had been there really since Mao Zedong had gained control of China and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces fled to Taiwan. We had stationed our 7th Fleet there really in protection of Taiwan. But that had increased tensions with China. Nixon pulls our 7th Fleet. That helps to ease tensions with China. And then in 1972, he makes a historic trip to China where the two nations agreed to improve relations. And now what this does for the Soviet Union is it makes them feel really uncomfortable, because here they've got their former ally China, which is now growing kind of, already starting to have some tense relations, some disagreements with China, and now China appears to be getting chummy with the United States, their Cold War ally. That puts pressure on the Soviet Union. They feel like they need to try to improve relations with the United States. So after learning of negotiations between the U.S. and China, the Soviets suggested a summit, which is a high-level diplomatic meeting between the two nations. And so in May of 1972, Nixon became the first U.S. president, to visit the Soviet Union. And ultimately, he begins to improve our relations with the Soviet Union as well. Nixon and the Soviets agreed to exchange scientific information, to increase trade, and to limit nuclear arms. The agreement to limit nuclear arms was known as the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I. Of course, actually at the time it was just known as SALT, because there wasn't a SALT II, but later it would be followed by a SALT II. So that kind of represented détente, and this is one of Nixon's greatest successes. One of the sad things about Nixon, because of the Watergate scandal, his great successes in foreign policy are largely overshadowed by Watergate, which is unfortunate because he was very good in terms of his foreign policy. Now, as far as appealing to Middle America, Nixon dismantled several federal programs to give more control to state and local agencies. And this is kind of somewhat in line with Republican thinking, more localized control, less bureaucracy from the federal government. As a part of his new federalism, Congress created revenue sharing plans that were designed to create more local control, but it actually created state and local dependency on federal funds. So it didn't have the intended effect. Nixon's economic policy, as far as that, he made efforts to reduce inflation, including the use of price and wage controls, but he also removed us from the gold standard because he believed that the American dollar should float freely like other currencies. Now, this does become very controversial because this allows us to expand the money supply. And to explain that in a little bit more detail, when we were on the gold standard, literally, our money was backed by gold. We could only have the amount of money in circulation that we had enough gold to back. And that limited the amount of money in circulation, which then kept our dollar kind of tied to that standard. So that kind of restricted inflation. When he takes us off the gold standard, we now can increase the money supply. And as we increase the money supply, in other words, we can increase the money supply without having the gold to back it. And what that does is it allows our inflation rate to increase dramatically. The good thing about that is that the government now can use the control of the money supply to try to regulate the economy. For example, if they want to stimulate the economy, they can make more money available or increase the money supply. That makes money cheaper, but hopefully encourages spending, which should stimulate the economy. A downside, like I said, it leads to inflation, and inflation can be problematic. And so Nixon did have to deal with inflation. So in this section, we're going to continue looking at the Nixon years, and our learning objective here is quite simple. We're going to describe Nixon's downfall. And we also will describe the constitutional crisis that arose from the Watergate scandal. So, first of all, we need to look at Nixon and his personality, which ultimately plays a huge role in his downfall. Nixon had become resentful of his critics during his political career. And he even had an enemies list of politicians and other members of the media that ultimately he felt had wronged him. At one point in time he felt like he was dead in the water. And the reality is, here's a guy who became vice president in 1952 when he ran, as a part of the Eisenhower administration or part of that ticket. And even dating back to that point in time, he was accused of being dishonest. He had to go before the nation in his Chequers speech to defend his position. And so, Nixon had this long history. He serves 8 years as the Vice President of the United States under Eisenhower. And then in 1960, he runs for the presidency against John F. Kennedy and loses. Now, normally, when you head a major party ticket and you lose, that's usually it for your political career, at least in terms of running for the White House. Rarely do candidates reemerge and run again. But Nixon was the exception. Nixon does come back in 1968 and runs, and of course successfully wins the White House. But he also had grown very resentful of people that he felt had stood in his way or prevented him from doing well. So during the 1972 re-election campaign, this is what really becomes sad, is that Nixon easily won the 1972 election, but Nixon and his supporters really looked to gain any advantage that they could, which really proved to be unnecessary, but still, they're looking for whatever advantage they can find. And this brings us to the Watergate break-in. So on the night of June 17th, 1972, so, we're talking really just, a few months, probably about 5 months out, from a little less than 5 months out from the 1972 election, Frank Willis, a security guard at the Watergate building in Washington, D.C., which was kind of a combination apartment/office building, he notices something kind of strange. He notices tape on the locks of the doors, which he thinks is a little bit strange. So he removes the tape, and then he comes back later and finds that the doors are taped again. Well, that makes him very suspicious, so he calls the police. 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters, which had their office in this Watergate building. They went there, of course, to try to gain campaign information and to place wiretaps so they could learn a little bit more about the Democrats' strategy in the election. So one of the burglars arrested was James McCord, an ex-CIA official and a member of the Committee for the Re-election of the President. As soon as questions about the break-in started, the cover-up started. Many did not believe that Nixon ordered the break-in, but it does appear that he did order the cover-up. So, as the 1972 election plays out over the next few months, many people believe Nixon when he said he had nothing to do with the break-in, and he wins the 1972 election by a landslide, defeating George McGovern and taking more than 60% of the popular vote. So things look pretty good for him. But there are numerous problems in his administration. One, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, has his own scandal and is forced to resign. So within the first year of Nixon's second term, Agnew is forced to resign. On October 10th, 1973, Agnew resigned facing allegations of accepting bribes. So Nixon picked Gerald Ford to replace Agnew as the new vice president. Also in 1973, the Watergate burglars went on trial, and their testimony opened the floodgates of accusations. John Dean, counsel to the president, testified that Nixon was active in the cover-up and break-in. It was revealed that Nixon had a taping system installed to record his conversations to help him with writing his memoirs. Now, this is something that many presidents do. When they leave the White House, they oftentimes, write their memoirs, and then those are sold. And there are many people that like to read about the presidents, read what the presidents were thinking at different times. And so Nixon's just trying to help himself with this process when he has the taping system put in. But ultimately it becomes a liability, because once people find out that there is this taping system, everybody wants to get their hands on the tapes. Every group that was investigating the Watergate break-in request access to these tapes. Nixon refused to turn over the tapes, citing executive privilege, which is, once again, the concept that the president's communications are protected as a matter of national security. Now, critics would say that the only time we ever see executive privilege really invoked is when they have done something wrong. And that does pretty much hold to be true. The justification for executive privilege is that, the president deals with highly classified stuff. The president does have to make decisions that are a matter of national security, and if the president has to release this information to the general public, it could jeopardize our national security. There is a legitimate concern there. So Nixon finally, feeling a lot of pressure to turn over these tapes, Nixon eventually turns over edited transcripts. These edited transcripts are turned over hoping that that's going to kind of appease the courts and the investigators, and that they'll kind of drop it. The independent special prosecutor that was appointed to investigate Watergate, Archibald Cox, went to court to request that the tapes be turned over. He's not satisfied with the edited transcripts, and of course he's wondering, well, what was edited out? So this leads to an incident that becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. And ultimately Nixon really doesn't help himself here, but since Cox refused to drop his subpoena for the tapes, Nixon requested that Attorney General Elliot Richardson fire Cox. And Richardson refused and resigned in protest. So now you've got, really an attorney general here who's fairly prominent, who resigns, and then, ultimately this doesn't appease anybody. And ultimately, because he refused to fire Archibald Cox, then Nixon's got to find somebody else to try to fire Cox. So he ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox, but he also resigned. So now you've got two resignations, two fairly high-profile resignations, and then finally the Solicitor General Robert Bork complied and fired Cox. So in the end, you've got Cox is fired. This was a special prosecutor investigating, and then you've also got two other high-ranking officials that have resigned in protest. The whole thing looks really bad for Nixon. And then we get to the so-called proverbial smoking gun In July, the Supreme Court ruled that the unedited tapes must be handed over, and Nixon complied. The tapes revealed that Nixon had approved a cover-up. Now, once again, that doesn't necessarily mean that he ordered a cover-up, but ultimately, on the tapes, he's kind of heard giving his consent to the idea of covering up what has taken place. So this really becomes Nixon's downfall. And like I said, that whole constitutional crisis is whether the president's communications should be protected. And there is a sense in which, yes, there's a legitimate need, but that also can be abused. And so, that's what the court really has to deal with. Should the president's communications be protected by executive privilege? All of this ends up leading to Nixon's resignation. Facing impeachment in the House of Representatives and a likely conviction in the Senate, Nixon resigned. Now, Nixon's resignation may not have come had he thought that he could survive impeachment. We've only had 2 presidents that have actually been impeached. The process of impeachment, a lot of people may think impeachment means removed, and that's not necessarily so. To be impeached, all it takes is for the House to pass impeachment charges. But it goes to the Senate for a trial, and the Senate can acquit or the Senate can convict. The Senate has some different options as far as what they can do. One of the things that they can do if they convict is remove the president from office. And I think most people believe that Nixon likely would have been convicted had it gone to the Senate, and it probably was going to pass the House. Nixon kind of was aware of what his potential fate was and went ahead and resigned. Now, the other presidents that have been impeached, we have to go all the way back to the Civil War for the first, and that was, or actually, I shouldn't say to the Civil War, but almost. We have to go back into the Reconstruction period. Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, then became president after Lincoln was assassinated. He was impeached. Largely, that was political. He survived conviction by a single vote, but largely it came down to the fact that a lot of radical Republicans during Reconstruction felt that he was too soft on the South because he was a Southerner, and they kind of set him up for that. The other impeachment happened actually after the Nixon resignation, and that happened in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president, and he had just been reelected to a second term when news broke that he had allegedly had an affair with a 21-year-old Washington intern named Monica Lewinsky. We'll talk more about that later, but in the case of in the case of Clinton, Clinton was impeached, but it went to the Senate where he too was acquitted. So we've never actually removed a president through the impeachment process. But Nixon, however, would have likely been removed, but instead he resigned, and he still remains the only president to have ever resigned from office.